afternoon and welcome to our current version of special events from Berghof Foundation. Today it is on how climate change conflicts can be managed locally. Now, I think that although there has been a debate in the past, it's increasingly established that there is a link between the two and that it is a strong one. And whatever has been the impact to date, what is likely to come as climate change becomes ever more intensified is likely to be that much greater. What it is that we need to focus on, we believe, and this is a topic that Berghof is extremely interested in, and we have a publication on this coming out in a month's time, is really what needs to be done at this point to strengthen local communities, especially in areas that are particularly affected both by conflict and also by climate change. So it is, what can we do to help local communities adapt to the climate change that is going to become ever more intensive? I now hand the floor to our moderator, Janelle. Over to you, Janelle.
Thanks, Andrew. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us from wherever you may be in the world. It is a real honor to moderate this panel today with three very esteemed panelists. As Andrew just mentioned, we will be taking this topic and really bringing it down to the local level, talking with people from Iraq and people from Somalia who are very much engaged in this type of work on the ground, making communities more climate secure. So I'm very, very excited about this event today. And we also have a wonderful researcher from Adelphi with us to talk about the need to really bring local communities into all of these approaches. So without further ado, I would very much like to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Amar Zakri, and he is the co-founding member and head of operations at Peace Paradigms. He has over 20 years of experience in conflict-sensitive community development, emergency response, and implementing projects in sensitive security areas of Iraq. Amar has experience in leading trainings in conflict sensitivity for international NGO staff and mobilizing communities and local authorities to improve sustainability. Amar has worked extensively with UN agencies, international NGOs, government authorities, and local stakeholders across Iraq to promote conflict-sensitive approaches. Amar, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Janelle. It's a pleasure to be here and honored to participate.
Thank you. So our second panelist is Sharif Abukar Ahmed. Sharif joined the Berghof Foundation in 2015 and has since then been intimately involved in our local level dialogues, strengthening infrastructures for peace and promoting local peace-building initiatives in both Hirshabelle and Galmudug states. Prior to this, he worked as an advisor to the president of Hirshabelle state and was district commissioner of Mahaday district for 3 years. Sharif has extensive experience in institutional capacity building, also with the Max Planck Foundation and community-led development. Sharif, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Janelle. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
And lastly, we have Dr. Beatrice Mosello, and she's a senior advisor on climate diplomacy and security at Adelphi. Her work focuses on researching and advising on climate and conflict-sensitive approaches that deliver on both resilience and peace. Beatrice has worked as a research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute in London and has a PhD in international studies from the Geneva Graduate Institute. She has been a visiting research fellow at the UN University Center for Policy Research, the London School of Economics and Political Science, and the American University of Central Asia in Bishkek. Thank you, Beatrice. Welcome.
Thank you, Janelle. It's a pleasure to be here, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Just a few logistical issues at the very beginning. We will have three separate rounds of questions for our panelists, and then we will have, hopefully, we'll have time for a question and answer session at the end. If you do have any questions, I would please ask you to put them into the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and we will look at all the questions and be able to identify which ones that we will have time to answer. Apologies in advance if we do not get the time to answer all of the questions. There is also an interpretation button down at the bottom. I think most of you will be listening to the event in English, so please just double check that the icon of interpretation is set on English for translation of Sharif's contribution. So thank you again. Welcome. Very much looking forward to it. And as Andrew said, we're not going to spend a lot of time in this event talking about what the effects of climate change are on these regions, but still, nevertheless, I think we do need to set the stage a little bit for the context that we're going to be talking about today. So I would very much like to turn to Ammar first and ask you what type of problems Iraq is currently facing due to the impacts of climate change, and what effects is this having on the communities there?
Thank you, Janelle. Currently, Iraq is facing water scarcity issues from reduced rainfall and river flows negatively affected from the source, in addition to declined water quality, which is severely impacting agriculture and health, lowering crops, destroying farms, forcing unemployment and displacement of farming and rural communities, and the urban income that relies on the agroeconomy. Loss of water and vegetation is reducing grazing land, forcing herders to illegally graze on private lands, sparking farmer-herder conflicts. Drought and desertification are degrading soils, harming agriculture, while sandstorms damage infrastructure and health through illnesses. Competition over depleted resources like rivers and groundwater has escalated tensions between tribes, villagers, upstream and downstream users, farmers and urban population. In summary, these climate change impacts are devastating livelihoods, forcing displacement, damaging health outcomes, and most dangerously, amplifying social tensions and conflicts. Urgent climate action tailored to local realities is essential to help Iraqi communities to cope with these challenges.
Thank you, Ammar. Thank you very much for setting the stage for us in Iraq. I'd like to turn to Sharif now and ask a very similar question. What kind of problems is Somalia facing due to the impacts of climate change? I assume they are similar to those in Iraq, but it would be good to hear if perhaps there are any differences. And how are communities adapting or not adapting to this new reality? Sharif. Sharif, can you hear us? Oh, there you are. Please, you're on mute. Go ahead.
Cabdullahi Maqlaysaa?
Yes.
Aadana mahadsan tahay.
Thank you very much.
Waxaa laga yaabaa Ammar waxyaabaha uu ka hadlaayo waxaan u maleynayaa inuu
I
ka
thought
hadlaayo.
that Ammar was talking something similar to what I said, what I wanted to say.
Sida Janal u sheegtay waa
As
isku
Janal
mid
said,
sababto
they are similar because of
caalamka waa waxyaabo jiro
in this world,
climate change-ga.
there is a climate change which has similar effects in many parts of the world.
Soomaaliya laakiinse waxaa laga yaabaa inuu si qaas oo iyada u gooniyo u saameynayo.
And also we have particular effects that are caused by climate change in Somalia.
Waxyaabaha ugu waaweyn oo Soomaaliya ka dhacayo
One of the major things that is happening in Somalia are
waa fatahaadaha iyo abaaraha oo ku soo noqday.
floodings and continuous droughts.
Labadaas shay ayaa waxaa ka dhalatay waxyaabo waaweyn oo dhibaatooyin ah.
These two things have caused so many things, so many problems that's been faced by Somalis.
Marka ka soo qaadana abaaraha oo ah wax guud ahaan Soomaaliya ka dhaco gees ilaa ka gees.
Something happens droughts happens very often in Somalia.
Sida la socotiin ummadda Soomaaliyeed waxay soo martay ku jirtaa 20 iyo dhowr sano oo dowlad la'aan ah.
And the Somalis have experienced more than 2 decades of stateless or not having a central government in position.
Taasaa sababaysa marka inay yihiin wadamada ugu nugul.
And this shows this is causing the vulnerability of Somalis to droughts.
Abaaraha ugu dambeeya oo ka dhaca 30 sano Soomaaliya
in the last 30 years
in
the last 30 years there were 18 different droughts which had a severe effects on Somalia.
Ummadda Soomaaliyeed noloshooda waxay ku tiirsan tahay laba arrin oo
most
beeraha
of
iyo
the
xoolaha.
Somali people livelihood depend on farming and livestock.
Marka abaaraha soo noqda waxay sababeen in
And
dadkii
these recurrent
Soomaaliya
droughts, those has
noloshooda beeraha
an
iyo xoolaha ku
effect
tiirsanayeen
on
dhaawac weyn
people
uu soo
who
gaaro.
had their livelihood on farming and livestock have been hit hard.
Waxaa dhacda marka in dadkii ku tiirsanay xoolaha inay
People who
xoolo
depended
beelaan.
on livestock, they lost their animals.
Taas waxay sababtay inay magaalooyinka waaweyn usoo ciirsadaan halkaasna ay ku
And they
noqdaan
have,
qaxootiin.
when they lost their animals, they went to the big cities and they became refugees.
Dhanka kale waxaad moodaa annagoo abaarihii sanadkan ka soo baxna sanadka dambe markuu roob da'o in meelaha webiyada ay
And
fatahaado
then-
aad u badan ka dhacaan.
And once the droughts happen, then a few years after there are floodings and torrential rains in Somalia.
Waxaad arkaysaa inay
And you
macnaha
see-
iyadoo sanadkii hore laga hadlayo abaaro iyo biyo
And you see
la'aan
that
iyo oon iyo xooliyo baaba'ay, haddana
you might
sanadkan laga
see that
hadlayo
last year we were talking about droughts and lack of water, and this year we talk about floodings and torrential rains.
mararka qaarkood waxaa dhacayso markii haddaan dib ugu noqdo markii abaaruhu dhacaan inay meelaha webiyada xataa webiyada guraan.
And in the previously, when there are droughts, even the rivers and they become dry.
Marka degmooyinka Soomaaliya
In most parts of
saameyn maahan.
Somalia, Somalis in different parts of Somalia, they don't experience the same similar experience of the climate change. Some experience the worst, and some not.
Waxaa laga yaabaa meelaha qaarkood inay dhaqdaan xoolaha sida geela kale oo adkaysi u leh abaaraha.
Some parts of Somalia they have camels which have resilience to the droughts.
Meelaha qaarkood inay loo dhaqdaan laga yaabaa kuwaasoo
And some others have
badanaa ku
cows.
ciirtooba abaaraha.
Some people own cows, and cows always are very vulnerable to droughts.
Dadka marka ku tiirsanaa noloshooda ay ku tiirsanaa xoolaha iyo beeraha markay soo barakacaan saameynaya magaalada.
So people who depend on farming and livestock, when they lose their livelihood, they come to the cities.
Waxay culays ku yihiin qaraabadooda iyo magaaladii.
And they become a burden to the city on their families who cannot afford to support them.
Waxaa kaloo jirta in nolosha baadiya markay soo baaba'do nolosha magaalada lafteeda ay ku xiran tahay
when livelihood in the countryside and in the rural areas is lost, then the life in the city becomes very expensive because there is a lot of interconnectedness between the two people.
Waxaa dhacaysa marka magaalada iyo baadiyada ka yimid in labadooduba ayagoo baahan magaalada ay u baahdaan gargaar la siiyo kuwii magaalada hore degan ay kuwii soo qaxaba labadaba ay baahida.
So this causes that people who live in the cities and people who come from the rural areas because of the climate change, both of them, the host communities and the people who come, they all have the same need and they become refugees or in need of support.
Waxaa intaas dhinac socda dadku markii xoolo ka baaba'aan inay dhirta guraan oo dhulkii oo nabaad guuro oo
when people lose their animals, what they do is they tend to the forest and they cut the trees, and they from there happens desertification.
Mar aan Cadala tagna waxaan weydiinay dadka
Once
magaalada
I went to the
baxay
Adala, to a city in Somalia, we asked people who come to the city
inay noloshooda isbedesho. Waxay noo sheegeen inay magaalada qaxooti ku yihiin dadkii ay u yimid.
They told us that they are refugees in the city and they are becoming a burden of the people whom they live with.
Mararkii hore waxaa dhici jirta dadka markay magaalooyinka xeebaha ay
Previously,
tagaan oo
when
abaaro
people
ku
go to
dhacaan
the coastal cities,
kalluumaysato noqdaan.
they used to become fishermen or
Laakiin hadda dadka
but nowadays people who come to the coastal cities
caalami ay joogaan oo
and there are now they cannot be fishermen because of the international military presence in the Somali shores, so they cannot be fishermen. They are afraid of those. So those people who live in the coastal areas, they are vulnerable because the people who lived in the coastal areas, their livelihood has been disturbed by or disrupted by the international presence due to the counter-piracy activities there.
iyo dadka xeebaha aad saameyn ay u yeelateen dabaylaha dhacay iyo bacaadada oo xirayo oo dhulkii wuxuu noqday dabaysha ayaa guurayso isbeddelka cimilada xeebaha kana kamid ah.
Because of the climate change, there are also sand storms, and this also causes havoc to the crops and the livestock.
Markii la yiraahdo dadka community-ga localkaasi ula dhiilgaraynaya arrimahan amba ula qabsanayaan.
Talking about how the people adapt or do not adapt to the climate change is very complex. It's not easy thing.
dal ka soo kabanayo dagaalo
People
sokeeye
who are relieving from civil war in Somalia, for example,
waa adagta la qabsi inay u
they are
yeeshaan arrintaasi.
experiencing difficulties in adapting to the climate change effects.
laakiinse haddii dhowr qodob aan ka soo qaado dadka
But
xoolaaleyda
I can cite few points.
gurguraan
People, when sometimes what happened to the people from rural areas, they come close to the cities with their animals,
xoolada ay quudiyaan kadibna ay
so
markaasi
that they
caano
can feed
iyo-
with feed their animals, so that they can sell milk in the cities.
waxaa jiro dad xoolada inta qayb ka iibiyeen beero u gateen
There are
kadibna ceelal
people
ku qotaan si ay u
who
waraabiyaan.
sold part of their animals and they started digging wells so that they can start farming.
dadka beeraleyda laftooda maadaama ay arkeen inay abaarihi soo noqonayaan waxay sameeyeen
and
inay
some of the
beero
people
ku
who
abuuraan sida
are
sisintoo
farmers,
kale iyo cawska xoolaha kale.
they have started planting and crops that can be that can live with the climate change.
dadka deegaanada aan soo booqanay oo sidii
In the
cadale
cities
iyo
where
warshiiq
I've
oo kale kamid
seen,
ah banaan
like
ka shaqeyna
Adala
aniga
and
Berghof
Warshiq, where we work as Berghof Foundation members,
dhinaca kale dhinaca galmudug aan ka shaqeyno sida
and
Matabaan oo
also
kale aan
in
shaqo
Galmudug and Mataban and other places that we have visited.
waxaa jiro wacyi ah oo dadku
There
inay
is an awareness
ogaadeen
among
inaan
the
dhirta la
people that
goynin marka
people
waa
shouldn't
arrin aad
cut
u
the
fiican in
trees,
dhirta
and
Yeah.
and that keeping the forest and trees is good for them. This is an awareness that's present there.
marka isku soo duubo
In
isbedelada
general,
cimilada
in
saameyntooda
conclusion,
Soomaaliya
climate
adduunka
change in
kale la qabtaa
Somalia
laakiinse si
has
taas ayay u
similar
nugushahay.
effects with the other countries in the world, but they have a particular vulnerability compared to other countries because of the civil war. And
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sharif. And thanks again to Amar to setting the stage for us. I think we see very, very similar situations in both Iraq and Somalia, with very dire situations because of climate change. And it is a holistic problem that affects urban communities as well as rural, and leads to situations where people come into conflict with one another because of dwindling resources. I would like to turn now to Beatrice, and the links between climate change and conflict are not always straightforward, and indeed they have often been controversial. But the experience of local communities, I mean, what we've just heard specifically about Somalia, clearly demonstrates this link. So what does the science and research field have to say about these links? And I promise to Andrew that we won't dwell very long on this.
Great, thanks, Janelle. Really good question. And as a researcher, I'm always, of course, very happy to talk about research, but I won't be too long, I promise. I think looking back at the last decade or so, made a really good progress in terms of the amount and the quality as well of the research dedicated to understanding the links between climate and conflict. We now moved away from the question that dominated early academic discussions in the 90s of whether there is a link between climate and conflict. I think this is quite clear now. We have it's become visible, and we have evidence from so many contexts around the world. And my fellow panelists very clearly depicted some of the very dire situations that we're seeing in places like Iraq and Somalia. We move, I think, in terms of research towards a more complex and more systemic understanding of how climate change impacts and the pressures they generate really can contribute to conflict. We now have a very substantial body of literature that examines the condition under which slow onset climate events, so looking, for example, rising temperatures, sea level rises, but also fast climate impacts, extreme weather events, as an example, affect the livelihoods of communities all over the world, change migratory patterns, transhumance patterns, challenge the basic structures, cohesiveness, and capacities of societies. And, in this large body of research that we have, research methods differ, research entry points for research differ, the research questions that have been looked at differ. But there is an overall agreement, I think, that the links between climate change and conflict are indirect, non-linear, and very complex. And we know that climate change acts together with other contextual factors of instability to increase the risks of violence and conflict in fragile society. So we talk about pathways, so ways in which climate and conflict risks interact. And again, as the other panelists highlighted, the most common pathways normally appear through disputes around natural resource management, food insecurity, migration patterns, livelihood insecurity, and more broadly causing issues around social cohesion, governance, and state legitimacy. Maybe rather than going into great detail in terms of the research that exists and maybe outlining some of these pathways, I think, again, the examples from the ground speak much more clearly to these than I would ever be able to do. 3 quick points in terms of where we are with research, some really important lessons learned in terms of how do we go about understanding these pathways. First of all, the importance of being able to combine quantitative climate data to understand what are the current and future climate trends and projections, and what do they mean on the ground, what is their impact on key sectors like water, agriculture, and health. But very important, these quantitative information that needs to be updated and as much as possible downscaled to reflect the realities of the local context needs to be combined with qualitative data that tell us about conflict analysis, contextual specific context analysis, as well as an assessment of the vulnerabilities and the resilience, the institutions that exist for resilience. So both understanding risks, but also understanding the opportunities to address these risks. Second important point that I think we came out of 10 years of more of research on these is that these pathways through which climate change and conflict interact and exacerbate the impacts of each other and vulnerabilities of people on the ground are really context specific. So yes, we can distinguish some pathways that are common and some general trends, if you want, but the way in which they will manifest and the risks they pose are very specific to each context. So very important that our analysis and our research is looks at the specific aspects. And when we mean local, it doesn't necessarily mean local within one country, but in some cases it's very important to consider also the regional dimension, because again, climate change impacts and these dynamics of conflict and vulnerability won't stop at the state administrative border. So local, yes, but also thinking about being able to capture how these dynamics play out beyond state, which has not been very easy to do in the past. I think a lot of the research tends to focus on a country level. We need to be able to go beyond that. And finally, I think the research is increasingly acknowledging and showing that certain factors such as gender, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, migratory status play a very important role determining how climate change impacts, threaten security or pose conflict risks in a given context. So very important to acknowledge and for research to adopt an intersectional approach that understands these dynamics and understand these differentiated impacts, not just gender. I think we've been relatively good at understanding the gender differentiated impacts of climate change and how they can affect and create insecurities. I think what we need to do going forward is really adding an understanding and disaggregating data analysis and collection, taking into account the other dimensions. So again, age, migratory status, socioeconomic status, disability, indigenous communities, all these aspects that really affect how people will experience risks and their capacity to cope with them. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Very interesting. I really like what you were talking about, context specific, and we will come back to that definitely in this event. And one of the things you said it hasn't been very easy, and that is something that I would like to turn to now, because I think that when you're faced with the complexity and enormity of this problem, so the impact of climate change on people and communities worldwide, and specifically in fragile contexts, and what that means for the exacerbation of the conflicts that people are already, have been experiencing, experiencing in their context, it can seem really overwhelming. So where do we start? How do we even begin to work on this type of issue? And so I'd like to turn to Sharif now to give us a little bit more information about how we are handling this on the ground in Somalia. So how do we begin to help communities adapt to climate change? And specifically, adaptation, we talk about communities adapting, but adaptation is very difficult, and it's really asking people to change their lives and change their livelihoods. But it's important that people adapt and that they can prevent further conflict as a result of the climate crisis. So I'll just turn over to you, Sharif, to hear a bit about the approaches and methods that you're using.
Thank you so much. Abdullah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hello.
Hello, I can hear you well.
Please go ahead, Sharif.
Abdullah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well.
aad u mahadsantahay Janelle.
Thank you very much, Janelle.
Anaga Berghof Foundation ahaan markii
As
aan
a
ka hadlo
Berghof
waxaan
Foundation,
qabanno
when we talk about what we do,
waxaa jiro Soomaalida badanaa khilaafyada markii la xalinayo lama fiiriyo
when we
maxaa sal
are
u ah.
when we are in Somalia, when we are resolving the conflict, people do not look into the root causes.
Marka xilliyadii dambe programmada Berghof waxaa lagu soo diray programmo quseeya
Recently,
arrimaha isbeddelka cimilada.
during the Berghof Foundation, we have added some programs regarding the climate change.
Marka dadka markii doodaha loo qabanayo ama shirarka ay ka
When
soo
we
qayb
have
galaan
debates
markii
and
la doodo
meetings
waxaa
and
dib loo ogaanayaa
information sessions, when we get to know that
in waxyaabaha ay salka ku haya badanaa ay tihiin kheyraadkii oo yaraaday.
Because of most of the conflict emanates from the resources scarcity.
Taas marka anagoo bidhaaminayna waxaan sameynay programmo badan oo radio programkii oo ka mid yahay oo weliya.
In order to show the people about the enormity of the climate change, we started radio programs.
Programmadaas oo ka baxo ugu yaraan 8 meel oo 8 radio oo Galmudug Hirshabelle
from different 80 radio stations in Galmudug or Hirshabelle.
maanta oo idin la hadlayo shir ayaan xamar ku qabanayna isku keenay xubnaha dowladda Hirshabelle.
Today we had a meeting for the Galmudug state members.
Qodobada laga hadlayana waxay ahayd sidii
Some of the points that we
wacyigelin looga
talked
sameyn
about
lahaa
is
arrimaha
how to
quseeya
start
isbeddelka cimilada.
awareness raising regarding climate change.
sababta marka aad fiiriso khilaafyadan oo dhacayo oo dadka reer miyiga badan dhex maraya waxay salka ku hayaan isbeddelka cimilada.
Are caused by the climate change.
marka waxyaaba ugu badan oo hore aan soo qabanayna haddana qorshayaasha ugu jirto in wacyigelin badan la sameeyo.
As we used to do previously, we want to start an awareness raising campaign regarding climate change.
sidoo kale waxaa ka jirta shabakad Hirshabelle iyo Galmudug ka shaqeysa oo 100 qofood oo khiyaarta ururada bulshada iyo haweenka iyo dhalinyarada iyo bulshada kala duwan.
Hirshabelle internet networks that are working in this regard.
waxayna qayb ka yihiin wacyigelinta iyo sidii loo dhowri lahaa deegaanka iyo dhirta iyo sidii loola qabsanayo sababtoo
awareness raising.
sababtoo maadaama climate change iyo wax taagan oo nala nool waxaan u baahanahay inaan si taxadar leh ula noolaano deegaankana la dhowro.
And because the climate change is something there, so we need to live and adapt to the climate change and change the approach and the way we do things.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharif. I appreciate that. A little information about how people we're reaching out to people on the local community through radio programs, for instance, and really reaching down into the communities to make sure that people understand what is happening in terms of climate change and environmental degradation and how this is affecting their lives and their livelihoods in conflict. And I think we'll come back to that, later about the real need to involve local communities. I'd like to turn over now to back to Beatrice. Much of the data we have about the impact of climate change remains too far removed from the communities to be of much use. And while the policy recommendations that we are giving, let's say the international community, the researchers, the data collectors, we're giving are really theoretical. So how do we bridge this gap between the research and the local communities? And what are the lessons learned from different initiatives that you've been involved in?
Thanks, Janelle. Very important question indeed, and one that has kept us occupied at Adelphi for many years, and definitely looking at this under our Weathering Risk Initiative, which for those of you that are not familiar with it, is a multi-partner, multi-donor project initiative looking at developing a methodology to assess the linkages between climate, peace and security, but also then using our understanding of those gathered through rigorous scientific analysis to input into policy making, into programming, so that that reflects the priorities that have been identified through the research. In this context, we've been very aware of the importance of communicating the research to local communities so that they can use it. But not only that, but making sure that the research incorporates and reflects the perspectives of the local communities. We've been doing this through in different ways, maybe rather than like keeping it theoretical. I'll bring in an example of a recent study that we've been working on, focusing on Haiti. It's a bit of a different focus from the two contexts we're talking about today, but hopefully will be helpful to illustrate and to respond, to answer the question that you just asked. So in Haiti, we've been working on a climate, peace and security assessment together with the UNEP, UN Environment Program, and UNDP Development Program in particular, but as you will hear, a lot of many other partners as well. When we started working on the study, we were very much aware that it would have been difficult for us to do fieldwork in Haiti because of the very dire security situation, and also we tend to not have consultants flying in and out approach. We go there 2 weeks, we do interviews, we come back, we write a report and pretend that we're the experts on that context. That normally doesn't really work well in our experience. So what we've done there has been to work with our partners to set up what has become a climate security working group that gathers more than 60 organizations, both UN agencies in the country, but also national, local level NGOs and civil society organizations, a very wide range of actors. And this group has been involved in defining the terms of reference for the study, being part of the study. So we conducted extensive consultations with them from, what research questions should we look at, and what is your experience in terms of answering these research questions, what kind of being involved in the data collection process themselves. To, of course, then communicating and validating the recommendations, the entry points for responses to climate, peace and security linkages that we've seen in the context of Haiti. So very much through across the entire duration and life of the study. We also work with local researchers to conduct interviews, and this has allowed us to, so building on their local expertise and their local network, and this has allowed us to reflect in our interviews and in our study the voices of young people losing their livelihoods in rural areas, having to go to Port-au-Prince, the capital city of Haiti, not having any job opportunity there, and joining armed gangs as a result. Young people leaving Haiti, going through very dangerous journeys to go to the US, sometimes being forcibly sent back, and finding themselves again with no livelihood, having lost their house, having lost their families, in a country that is in a very difficult political and security situation. The voices of women at the market, not being able to sell their products because of the prices falling, of climate change impacting what they're able to cultivate in their small pieces of land. All these voices that, otherwise we would never been able to access, and we wouldn't have been able to reflect in our study. So that's been a very important result in terms of what the study was able to talk about and incorporate. But also, I think working with the Climate Security Working Group has allowed us, has allowed the findings of the report to be owned as well by their very own people that will then have to act on them and implement some of the recommendations that are included on the report. So that's also a very important element, right? Because to be honest, a lot of the action that will be taken to address some of these risks will be taken at the local level. So it's important that the results of our research reaches that level. And one last point, maybe here is also communication is key. So obviously, again, local stakeholders be involved in the research so that they understand the research itself and are part of shaping the analysis, but also the recommendations and the solutions that the research puts forward. But also for those that are not directly involved, the communication is key. And for the work in Haiti, we've been working with a local NGO on a communication plan that involves translating the key outputs of the report and policy brief in Creole, Haitian Creole, the local language, but also for the key findings to be showcased or communicated via radio, prepare flyers that will be available at the mayor's offices in various rural localities of Haiti as well. Just again, because the findings are relevant for the local communities, are the ones that are going to have to act on them. So very important that we try to be innovative in terms of finding ways to reach out to them with the research that we do.
Great, thank you so much. That was very interesting. I think the idea of how to get the information to the people, you know, who it is most valuable for is really, really critical for this work. And I think that we're all trying our best to bridge this gap. I would like to hear from Ammar now. Well, first of all, you know, what you, Ammar, think about, you know, what Sharif has said in terms of awareness raising on the local level. If you feel that that's very valuable for the work that you do in Iraq, but also about what Beatrice has said. And specifically, you know, you are involved in a lot of dialogue around climate change and conflict in Iraq. And I would love to hear how dialogue, especially local level dialogue, can play such a valuable role in tackling the challenges these communities face and contributing to finding solutions.
Thank you, Janelle. It's really interesting and fascinating to listen what Sharif and Beatrice mentioned regarding the local level dialogues and how important they are. The concept absolutely the same. For us, we believe that local level dialogues offer unique advantages in tackling context-specific climate change impacts and resulting tensions. And through mentioning some of these advantages, I will mention a couple of examples about our current work with Berghof. But to start with advantages, I would say the locals directly experiencing climate impacts can best diagnose risks, needs, and conflict factors invisible to outsiders. Traditional community knowledge is vital to design context-appropriate, socially accepted solutions. And I give example here. In Zubair, for example, currently we are supporting a dialogue process there, which is or the main cause of it is the displacement, internal displacement from rural areas to Zubair, which is an urban context. What we did is that we utilized the local network that we have of facilitators, and the lead facilitator for Zubair is a person from Zubair. So he is very well knowledgeable about the context of Zubair. The traditional knowledge regarding peace processes, if you may, is crucial here. Janelle, do you still hear me? Because I get message about the internet connection. You still hear me?
Yes, you were out for just a few moments, but yes, we can hear you just fine. Thank you.
Excellent. For Zubair again, because it is also a conservative context, the reaching out to religious scholars from the Shia sect, which is the majority of population, is also an important tool that we have in order to cross-check the sensitivity of the terms of the community agreement that will be designed. So another advantage to local level dialogues is that local peace platforms bridge divides between conflicting groups, easing tensions and preventing violence. And another example I can give here. And today we had a session to tackle the intervention we have in Tel Afar, which is a district from Ninawa Governorate, where we utilized the Tel Afar District Working, which is a community level group, consists of administrative leaders, tribal leaders, religious leaders, activists, youth, women, who has been trained by several actors, worked on several conflicts in Tel Afar, utilizing them to tackle the issue of water sharing agreement, to support the different conflicting groups to work together, utilizing their knowledge how to deal with conflict analysis and designing resolutions. Another advantage to local level dialogues is that grassroots monitoring guarantees climate policies tangibly improve livelihoods and security on the ground. Another advantage, which is the bottom-up local insights, must feed into top-down national policies for coordinated and effective action. In essence, local intervention, knowledge, and participation is necessary to diagnose and resolve climate security challenges in collaborative, sustainable, and conflict-sensitive manner. Over to you, Jenna.
Thank you, Amar. Thank you very much. Very interesting information about the benefits of local level dialogue, and you can arguably say that local dialogue is very, very valuable for resolving conflict, even in times where there is no climate change or there was no climate change. This is a very, very valuable approach. But in the new reality of climate change impact and environmental degradation and the exacerbation of conflict, dialogue becomes all that much more important. Like you said, to bring in traditional knowledge, to bridge divides between communities who are potentially in conflict with each other, for them to learn together about the impacts of climate change. Thank you very much for that. Just a quick note for anybody who would like to submit a question, the F&A, the question and answer icon is available. You can drop your question into the chat already so that we can have a look at what questions we can ask. Thank you very much for that. I have just the last round of questions for each of our panelists. This time I would like to start with Beatrice. And I think that, obviously from what everyone's been saying on this panel, there is a critical need to engage local communities in awareness raising and dialogue. And I think that's not up for debate right now. But in the end, that won't always be enough to allow communities to live together peacefully and to sufficiently adapt to the realities of climate change. So what else can be done? What else do we need to do?
Thanks a lot, Janelle. Well, I think that we need to become better at doing programming that addresses these links in an integrated way. The good news is that with the more research, we also had whole range of investments, programs, and projects in this space, both from the climate change perspective, from the climate change adaptation angle, trying to incorporate an element of conflict sensitivity and making sure that climate change adaptation interventions not only do not exacerbate existing conflict situations, but also are done in such a way that can contribute to peace and conflict resolution. But also from the peace building community, there's been a lot of moves and innovations in terms of programming that not only goes in to address conflict dynamics, but does so in a way that also addresses some of the key climate risks that people on the ground are facing. So bringing in an element of climate adaptation and climate resilience. So this integrated programming, climate and peace building integrated programming has really taken roots in the last couple of years. We've seen these from at the UN level, from agencies like the Peace Building Fund, for example, with a large and growing portfolio of climate security, climate conflict programming. as well as the NGO level with NGOs like Mercy Corps, for example, showing some really innovative practices in terms of how to do this. What is missing? What do we need to do more? I think the practice emerging out of this growing body of work, of projects and programs that we're seeing on the ground points to a number of issues here. I think, first of all, there's the need to do more of internal reflections and understanding what is working and what is not working. So really embedding a very important element of monitoring and evaluation into the projects and programs that we do, but also in the longer term, trying to develop approaches to measure the impact that our projects have. And from the peace building community, you will know that measuring the impacts in terms of peace of a project is not an easy task, and also not something that can be done in 2 or 3 years at a time frame. We're talking about long-term processes. So how do we capture these impacts in the long term? And Adelphi is working with Berghof and other partners in the Wedding Risk Initiative, again, the peace pillar, exactly looking at these questions about how do we measure the impact of these integrated programs and interventions. So really important first point in terms of becoming better at understanding what works and what doesn't, and improving the way we do programming in this sense. I think there's also a need, and a big shout out to the need for more funding to go to these projects and to these interventions. Funding that, first of all, needs to be better at reaching the most vulnerable places and people. So, climate funding being able, and this big debate discussion now going on ahead of COP28. How do we make climate finance better at reaching fragile and conflict affected states? Lots of work that needs to be done there. But so more and better climate finance there, but also how do we make sure that the funding we have goes to the local level? And I think that's another really important discussion to be had. There are some really good examples there. The Peace Building Fund I mentioned before has a large portfolio of these integrated programs on the ground. Also targeting and reaching out to and working with local partners, local implementers. So a lot of lessons to be learned from there. But again, it's an open chapter, I would say, as a researcher, that needs more words, needs to more writing to be done there. So more monitoring and evaluation, more learning, and more funding, I would say.
Thank you very, very much. Much of this was music to my ears working in this field. So integrated programming is definitely critical for me, and more effective monitoring and evaluation, and specifically looking at what's effective on the ground, and of course more funding for this. I think that is really, really critical in order to be able to do this type of work. I'd like to turn over to Anmar and really pose the same question to you. So what else needs to be done beyond and complementary to dialogue? So how do we limit the escalation of conflicts due to climate change? Anmar.
Yes, Janelle. While dialogue is critical, but technical and okay, you still hear me, right? No technical issues.
We can still hear you. Please go ahead.
Cool. As I said, yes, dialogues are critical, but technical and governance steps are also needed to address climate conflict risks. Such steps could be upgrading infrastructure like irrigation systems, flood barriers, climate-proofing buildings. These will help communities better adapt to climate impact physically. Another thing can be done is implementing disaster risk systems, including early warning, communication, emergency stockpiles, and evacuation protocols will protect lives and assets when climate shocks like flood or heat waves occur, like we see in Iraq context. Another thing is adopting climate-smart agriculture techniques can assist farmers and grazers in maintaining productivity and food security despite growing drought. This includes switching to drought-tolerant crops and appropriate livestock. Another thing is nature-based solutions like reforestation, wetland restoration. These will boost ecological resilience and controlling sandstorms and floods. And bear in mind, of course, that I'm talking about Iraqi context mainly here. Another step is diversifying and combining livelihood sources. For example, integrating crop farming and livestock raising, combining them together can reduce reliance on activities vulnerable to climate change. Another thing is empowering local authorities through decentralization, which is very relevant to the Iraqi context. This will enable rapid responses tailored to context-specific climate-related tensions. A final step, I would say, implementing rigorous environmental regulations and enforcement is a key to curbing sustainable resources usage and degradation. Together with inclusive community dialogues, these technical adaptation and governance steps can help manage climate pressure and stabilize intercommunal relations. Over to you, Jen.
Thank you, Amar. Very, very interesting, and I'm glad you brought in the governance aspect to this. And I think that we're going to come back to this in a bit in the question and answer session. Empowering and strengthening local authorities, because in the end, these are initiatives that the local governments do and want to be a part of and do need to be a part of. I'd like to turn over for the last official question of the event to Sharif and talk about these needed investments and technologies just outlined by Amar. So we talked about, disaster risk management, wetland regeneration, all of these technical climate change interventions that are quite beyond what local communities can afford. They're beyond what local communities themselves can achieve. So the question is how do we bridge this, and how do we harness the agency of local communities in Somalia, in Iraq, while ensuring these type of large-scale initiatives to make people more climate secure? Sharif.
Thank you, General. Markii laga hadlayo isbeddelka cimilada ee saameyntooda ma ahan wax waxay u baahan tahay dadaal midaysan oo dhinaco badan ka imaanayo.
When we talk about climate change and its effect and mitigating its effects, it needs more joint efforts from different parts of the partners.
waxa midda wanaagsan hadda idin sheegi kara waxa waaye mar aan la kulmay sarkaal ka socda wasaaradda biicada dowladda wuxuu sheegay madaxweynuhu inay ka go'an tahay oo priorityka labaad ay u tahay marka laga soo gudbo la dagaalanka al-shabaabka in wax laga qabto isbedelada cimilada iyo saameyntooda waana arrin aad u wanaagsan in dowladda commitmentkaas ay gaarto.
The good news that I want to share with you is that when I met with the official from the Minister of Environment, he told me that the president of Somalia, the second priority of the president of Somalia after fighting Al-Shabaab is doing something related to climate change.
waxyaabaha hadda dowladda ugu dhawaada waxaa ka mid ah in la sameeyo area oo protected area oo loogu talagala gobolkaas in laga sameeyo oo seera ah si dhulka uunu nabaad guurin waqtiyada abaarahana xoolo helaan meel ay daaq helaan.
One of the key things that the government is planning to do is that starting protectorate areas in every region so that there is no desertification, and so that whenever there is a drought, animals and livestock can get somewhere they can go and eat.
waxaa kale oo qorshaysan in 1 milyan oo geed talaala sanadkan gudihiisa.
And another plan is to plant almost 1 million tree in Somalia this year.
marka haddii la helo siyaasad cad oo dowladdu ay leedahay iyo shuruuc baarlamaanka uu dejiyo lagu dhowraa deegaanka iyo fulinta dowladda waxaa fududaanaysa in hay-aduhu wax ay qabanayaan ay noqdaan wax la taaban karo oo dhala natiijo wanaagsan.
If there are clear guidelines from the government and legislations that protect the environment from the parliament and coupled with the implementation and sustainability, there will be an effects on the ground, good effects on the ground.
annaga maadaama peace building aan nahay mararka qaarkood markii aan dadka aan la kulmayno oo aan weydiino ii sheegay khilaafyada meesha sal ku hayaan waxaan badanaa ogaanaa in ay saameynta isbedelada cimilada ay saameyn weyn ku leh dagaalada ka dhaca deegaanada baadiyaha.
And as a peace builder working in many parts of Somalia, when we talk to the people who are in conflict, the one of the key factors of the conflict is climate change, specifically in rural areas where people have livestock.
dadku marka waa desperate, noloshoodii yaa burburtay, dhirtii ay jarayaan, maxaa la dhahay xoolahoodii ayay u raadinayaan waxay cunaan, carruurtoodii waxay cunaan u raadinayaan. marka waxaa loo baahan yahay in loo helo wax lagu bedeli karo.
People are desperate. They look they're looking further for their animals, food for their kids, and their livelihood is damaged, so that we need alternatives.
marka annaga as a building organization ahaan waxaan u baahanaha kaliya ma istaagi karno. marka waxaan u baahanaha developmentalka iyo hay'adaha ka shaqeeya mashaariicda horumarinta iyo annagoo peace building ka shaqeynaa aan iskaashano, sababtoo haddii mashruucada si isolated loo qabto wax micnaa ma sameynayaan.
We as peace builders, we cannot stand on our feet alone. We need other organizations that work in the humanitarian area so that they can support us. So unless we have a unified efforts and coordinated efforts, and scattered effort will not do more good things.
tusaale haddaan kuu soo qaato, nin odaya ayaa dhir jaraya, markaasaa la yidhi dhirta ha jarin, dhirtu deegaanka ayay u fiican tahay, nabaad guura dhacayo, noloshiina waxaa waa isbedelka cimilada saameyntiis way sii badanaysaa, deforestation dhacayo. waa looga sheekay geedka, markaasuu intuusan u fiiriyo wuxuu ku dhaha walaalow geedka anigaa kaaga aqoon badan oo ku dhahay, aqoonta aan u leeyahay geedkan adigu ma lido dhaha, laakiinse aniga maanta waxaan doorbidayaa intii carruurta dhimalaad inuu geedku dhinto.
For instance, when some people talk to, or organization talk to people cutting the trees, and they tell them how important it is to preserve the trees and the environment, and that the deforestation happens because people cut trees, that person who is cutting the trees might tell civil society organization that I know everything you are saying, but here what I have no other choice. I have to feed my kids, otherwise my kids are going to die.
marka waxaa loo baahan yahay haddaan soo koobo siyaasad cad oo dowladdan hadda waxay u muuqataa inay commitmentigeeda oo committed ay ku tahay waxyaabahan oo ku saabsan arrimaha isbedelka cimilada. haddii marka dowladda xaggeeda laga hela siyaasad cad iyo inay committed ku tahay, waxaan isleeyahay hay-aduhuna ay mideeyaan dadaalkooda in wax wanaagsan oo natiija la gaari kara. waa mahadsantiin.
And as I think the government of Somalia nowadays is very committed, but if they develop a clear guidelines with a commitment to implement all the guidelines, and if we also find unified efforts and visions from the different patterns and organizations in Somalia, I think some tangible results would be achieved. And thank you, he said. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Sharif. I think the plea for a unified and coordinated approach between different organizations, between humanitarian, peace building, development organizations, is very much in line with what Beatrice was saying earlier about integrated programming and how critical this is in places, and specifically in fragile contexts. I would like to turn over now to the question and answer session. We only have 15 minutes left, so I do apologize in advance if we do not have the opportunity to pose all of the questions that have been sent into the chat. Thank you very, very much for your questions. I do have a few that I've selected, and I would like the first question to go to Amar. There is a question for you, and it's in the question, I'll just read it for you. I was wondering if you have any insights on balancing the need for action and leadership at the community level to tackle these key issues within a political landscape that is very often hostile to civil society and community movements. So are there ways that donors and international NGOs can help protect local leaders from this potential backlash? Over to you, Amar.
Thank you, Janelle. A very interesting question. Yes, it is challenging, and it is important to do a proper, in my opinion, context analysis and to work together with the community leaders after going through a careful actor mapping, analyzing, within the mapping, the political affiliations, the in our language, we use the term to classify doves and hogs, the supporters and the let's say the figures who are against. The political agendas with the proper local analysis, context analysis. Dialogue process can be designed. In addition, there are within the traditional tribal leadership and local community leadership, there are strong figures with good respect by even the politicians. And of course, we do not forget that even tribal leaders, they have connections with the politicians, given the tribal connections. So utilizing the actors, the tier one tribal leaders can be a protective measure. In addition, proper capacity building for the activists in terms of context analysis, conflict analysis, in order to utilize their activism paired with proper capacity building and tackling dialogues. And all these processes should be designed within the local context, understanding the local hierarchies and systems, and also understand the political and the governmental agendas as well, to be put all on the analysis table when you design such a process or a direct process. That's a general answer, I would say.
Thank you very much, Amar. Yes, I think, turning to the government relations is something that we didn't have a chance to tackle in this event so much, but it is very, very critical. Working with community leaders, working with government authorities, district level authorities, regional, national level, and that adds an element of complexity to any sort of work that happens on the local level.
Yes. In addition to this, is that to identify entry points. And for our specific work, when we talk about climate change-induced conflicts, currently the Iraqi government feels the importance of interventions related to climate change. That's why we are seeing the landscape is open, let's say, in different interventions, because according to the government statement, it is crisis mode right now. It's no more luxury discussion. So that's one of the important entry points for us.
Thank you very much. I will come back to you in a few minutes with another question, but my second question is for Beatrice, and I will just read the question out from one of our participants. You spoke of the necessity of tying locally focused strategies to a larger regional process. And sometimes this can seem like walking a slippery slope with highly tailored, localized approaches on one end and regional, overarching, potentially politicized efforts on the other. So how would you recommend bringing these sometimes very different realities together?
That's a very good question. I was reading it in the question and answer box, and I was hoping that we get to there, because I do think it is a very slippery slope, and it requires very careful thinking about how to best do it, and in what circumstances as well. Sometimes a local approach is what you can do, and that's what is going to give the best results, and you don't need to go to the regional level. In other cases, instead, you need to make the linkages to broader dynamics beyond the very specific local context, because, as I was mentioning before, climate impacts are not localized and happen just in one city or in one department. They do have a broader effect, and if you only address impacts in one context, you risk maybe creating an even worse situation in the neighboring context and making conflict dynamics worse. So understanding the scale at which you operate is the first stop. Yes, that you need to make in your path towards addressing these complex risks. I think then the how to when you want to do this connection to other levels as well, then the importance of understanding how to navigate politics is key. And I think Amar made a very important point about dialogue. He was referring about local dialogue, but I think it extends to also regional dialogue and starting small and building trust between actors at different levels through a process of dialogue that is what in the end can help overcome some of the kind of more political obstacles that can come in the way of a more integrated approach from a geographical perspective as well. There are some really interesting examples of doing this again in the Peace Building Fund portfolio, where they have funded some projects, particularly in the Sahel, that have a more regional dimension. And also the OSCE, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, has a very interesting, again, project looking at climate-related security risks. And also they adopt a regional perspective. The idea of that project is really to use climate change as an entry point to build trust and improve regional cooperation in a number of regions they're working on. We're actually working as Adelphi with them on this. And again, it's a really interesting project that shows the importance of building this trust building process through dialogue across time, eventually starting with more technical topics that can then be scaled up and broadened to bridge also other topics that may be more politically difficult to otherwise tackle. Over to you, Janelle.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. I hope we did manage to answer the question sufficiently, but it's a very difficult dilemma. Also, from what I've found, bringing the very practical information from the local level up to a more theoretical level at the regional level, how do you make the theoretical a bit more practical? But yeah, we could probably discuss this for many hours. I have another question. I think it's for both Sharif and Amar, and it refers to the IDP populations that are obviously growing in both Somalia and Iraq. So climate-induced migration, it's a consequence of both environmental stress and conflict. So this participant would like to hear more about how local communities are coping with these IDPs. What strategies are being employed to mitigate conflict, to mitigate political tensions and resource conflicts. And I can only assume that in each region of Iraq and Somalia, this is handled quite differently, because this goes back to local district authorities that have these strategies. But I would like to hear a bit more about what strategies are being used to mitigate this conflict. I'll ask you, Amar, first, and then I'll turn over to Sharif.
So the question, what are the community strategies to deal with it, right?
I would say not just the community strategies, although that's very interesting, but also the government strategies. So what are the strategies overall to deal with IDPs and to reduce the conflict around the reasons why they are displaced?
Unfortunately, we have two challenges, or two layers of complications regarding the Iraqi context. First of all, the local economy, livelihoods are fragile due to climate change and the financial crisis and the long-term corruption. Accordingly, it is adding a clear complication to the communities due to the new waves of displacement. The second complication is a chronic one back to the ISIS era, starting from 2014. Where Iraq witnessed a massive wave of displacement. We are talking about 2.5 million displaced people. Unfortunately, we witnessed cases where the local populations are linking the new displacement to that era of ISIS. So the newcomers are considered ISIS-related population, are getting displaced to their new governments. And this is adding a new complication to the conflict. The government till now is not yet recognizing or acknowledging that the climate change-induced displacement as a reality or as a fact. Although IOM, the international agencies are, and also the Ministry of Migrants and Displaced, are starting to advocate for the importance of modifying government strategies and allocate funds to respond to this. Yet we are not seeing any federal level strategies to tackle this issue. That's why we see the local communities are leaning on the traditional conflict resolution approaches to deal with that. As I said earlier, in the example of Zubair, is where tribal leaders are left to deal with the issue of themselves. And the local governorates or governments are also learning from the experience, utilizing what they've learned from ISIS time, how to deal with the displaced. And the local social fabrics are acting as the safety net in terms of supporting the newly displaced. And also the tribal linkages are playing a positive role in understanding the problem and trying to solve it. But unfortunately, there are no governmental strategies to deal with this new wave of displacement.
Thank you very much, Amar. I would pose the same question to Sharif about the IDP communities in Somalia. What are the strategies on the part of the government or on the part of the communities to deal with this influx of IDPs into rural areas and to support them?
aada mahadsantaha Janaal. Su-aashu waa su-aal guud laakiinse uma hadli karo Soomaaliya wixii ka jira badanaa sababtoo degaan gooniya hay'addu ka shaqeysaa. anigana shakhsiyan background-gayga degaan gooniyaan ka shaqey jiray, haddana hay'adda uga shaqeeyaa. marka su-aasha waxaan jeclaan lahaa si specific oo deegaanka Hirshabelle inaan ku saleeyo. marka aad fiiriso marka deegaanka Hirshabelle waxaa badanaa dadku kusoo barakacaan fatahaadaha ayaa aad u soo noqdo. marka dowladda hoose waxaad moodaa doorkeedii inuuna muuqan oo ay bedeshay NGOs-ka. marka NGOs-ka ayaa had iyo jeer u qareemo u doodo u hadla dadka.
And regarding my background and where I live, because I work and live in Hirshabelle, and I haven't seen most of part of the Somalia, so I would only specifically base my question to Hirshabelle district, so where I work, and I know much. So most of the displacement that happened in Hirshabelle district is caused by the flooding. And when flooding happened, the local government response is very limited or is absent, and it seems that the local government's roles is being replaced by NGOs who are usually advocating and helping people who are displaced by the floodings.
arrinta iyada lafteeda mudnaanta laho in la sheego u baahan waxaa waaye ummadda Soomaaliyeed waxay u samaysantahay qaab hele iyo qabiila iskugu xirantahay. marka badanaa dadku markay dhibaato kusoo dhacdo in ka yar 10% ayaa xeryaha qaxootiga ku dhammaatay. inta kale waxay kusoo qaxaan oo la soo degaan oo caawiyo dadka eheladooda iyo dadka ehelada fog oo qabiilka ay isla wadaagaan.
Interesting point that's worth mentioning here is that in Somalia, people in Somalia are tribal, and most when displacement happens, most of the people, the majority of the people, go to the places where their tribes live, so that they are supported and hosted by these people who are hailing from their tribes. Only few people, about 10% of the displaced people, go to the refugee camps. Others, they head to where their people live and they stay with them.
marka mararka qaarkood dowladuhu ay soo farageliyaan waa mararka ay lafada baaq ay ku ogyihiin baaq ay diraan sababtoo markay masiibo weyn oo kale ay dhacdo sida fatahaad oo kale waxaa laga yaabaa maamulka degmada oo kale inuu baaq diro. marka wax baaq ka badan ay hadda hayaan ma jirto.
The only thing that the local government do is that they appeal for help through the local government or to international organization to come and support them.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the answers to those questions. We are sadly out of time in this event. We only got through 3 of the questions that were posed by the participants. So thank you very much. I know that the team and I will try to go through the questions later and potentially get answers for those people who weren't able to hear answers now. I would like to just take 2 more minutes and have each of the panelists potentially say just 30 seconds of something, a message that they would like to get across to everyone watching in this event. Beatrice, I will start with you.
Thank you, Janelle. Great event, great discussions. I feel like I learned a lot, and I feel we need to have more of these discussions about highlighting the role of what happens at the local level and thinking about how we can integrate these voices more, and also how do we make finance go more to the local context. I think that's a crucial question that needs to keep us very busy over the next weeks, months, and years to come.
Thank you very much. Sharif, any final last words?
awoodda hala mideeya gacmawada jiray wax ku qabtaan climate change waa wax jira waana wax ballaaran oo si individual wax looga qaban kara marka midnimo iyo in mashaariicda iyo dowladda la soo kaashado.
Climate change is something there, and where we see the effects of climate change in Somalia, and the response to this is unity, joint vision, and collaborated efforts. In that way, we can do something.
Thank you very much. And Amar, I will give you the last word.
Thank you, Janelle. I would say that climate change acts as a threat multiplier in Iraq and in different contexts, interacting with governance issues and social grievances. Technical adaptation alone is inadequate. Inclusive climate dialogues enabling marginalized communities are equally vital. Local knowledge must inform national policies with urgent cooperative action centered on public needs. Climate impacts can be transformed from risk into an opportunity for peace building and resilience.
Thank you very much, Amar. And with that, I would like to thank our wonderful panelists for their very insightful thoughts today. I would also like to thank our wonderful interpreter, Abdullah, from Djibouti, joining us today, and to Nadine and the rest of the comms team for organizing such a wonderful event. Thank you very much, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.